Right, okay, morning everyone. So continuing on with this theme of how personality research can be applied in the real world, what we're going to talk about today is how it's been applied in the field of politics. What I'm going to do is sum up as best I can this text I have that really kind of puts together all of the literature on this, because I think the research findings on how personality can predispose you to preferring certain political orientations is actually very interesting, and probably, if more people knew about it, would find it very interesting and insightful, but it's kind of an area of research that not very many people do know about. I've told you some of the highlights already when we talked about the big five. So, for example, those on the political right who are more conservative are more tilted towards orderliness, or having higher scores of orderliness, okay, the aspect of conscientiousness. And then also, if we split agreeableness into the aspects, they're higher in the politeness aspect of agreeableness. And then on the left, okay, so more liberal, progressive ideas, those on this side are typically higher in openness and typically higher in the other aspect of agreeableness, which is compassion. Now, out of all of these, openness is the best predictor, okay? Meaning if someone is high in openness and high in conscientiousness, then statistically they're more likely to be liberal than they are to be conservative, okay? So when I talk about the left and the right, you probably have a pretty general idea already of what I mean by that. But just so we're clear, these terms come from the French Revolution in 1789, when there was the debate on whether to abolish the monarchy. Those who wanted to abolish the monarchy were told to stand on the left, and those who wanted to maintain the monarchy were told to stand on the right. Not very long after this, political parties in France then began having the left and the right in their party names, and then this spread across Europe, and then the terms spread further than that still. So what we usually mean by those on the right are those who are more tilted towards being more patriotic, nationalist, in certain circumstances more likely to support the monarchy, tradition, okay, hierarchies. But of course, it's a spectrum, okay? So it ranges from, conservatives to the very extreme ends in which there's fascists, right? And then on the other end, in which we have the left, more characterized by challenges to tradition, okay? More gravitation towards equality and reform, progressiveness. Again, of course, it's a spectrum, okay? So, on one end, we have social democrats and liberals, and then on the extreme end, we have communists and other more extreme political views, okay? Now, there are some criticisms of this spectrum. First of all, there's some political movements that don't really fit very clearly onto the spectrum. Here in the US, it does seem to be those more on the left that are more supportive of issues to do with being more green and being more aware over climate change and so on. But that's not a common finding across the world, okay? There's plenty of countries in which both the right and the left are equally in support of policies to do with battling climate change. And then other issues that, have in some cases been more characterized by being more on one side, like feminism, which, nowadays here in the US is more, again, put on the kind of left side of the political debate. But it wasn't always the case, right? The original suffragettes and suffragists in the UK who protested for rights for women and vote for women, they were mostly conservative women. And then there's a number of people who claim to be moderates and who claim to be, on the center of this spectrum. And they say that they don't align with either of the left or the right. And I would say that's a valid criticism. There's certainly some people who, vote independent and who don't vote for either the political right or political left parties. But the big proponents of this spectrum, such as Jonathan Haidt, has said that, when people are actually kind of almost forced to make a choice, if one says, well, I don't align with either the right or the left, okay, I'm a moderate, so I'm an independent, But you say, well, what if you had to choose? Which one would you choose? In most cases, it's actually pretty easy for them to then, choose one or the other. So that would support the idea that, most people do have some sort of tilt more naturally towards one or the other. But obviously the spectrum is very simplistic, right? People vote for a whole bunch of different reasons. There's different motivations behind voting. And so trying to capture that motivation, the reasons for that behavior on just one spectrum is obviously going to be too simplistic, okay? There's also some debate that maybe the political spectrum as we view it is a little bit maybe outdated, and that maybe the classic social and economic debates are no longer at the core of what causes differences in voting behavior. So for example, in 2006, Tony Blair, Prime Minister at the time of the UK, said that open versus closed was now the most prominent debate in politics and the one that most decided which party one would vote for, rather than the classic issues on the right-left spectrum. And this would certainly help make sense of some, political figures who, on this spectrum, would be really on the same side, but have very different views on the open versus closed debate. So for example, former Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, and former President here, Donald Trump, both on the right of this spectrum, both more conservative, but they have entirely different views on whether borders should be open or closed, okay? So that's a real difference, okay, that, in many cases matters to the voting population that wouldn't be characterized, okay, on this typical spectrum. Another kind of counterpoint to this spectrum is that the political spectrum isn't really so much a straight line, it's more of a horseshoe, and that's the horseshoe theory, which really means that as one gets more extreme, okay, on either side, as we get more to the outer edges, then it's bending upwards like a horseshoe, meaning that those at the extreme ends actually have more in common with each other than they do with moderates, and that those who are more moderate, but one moderate right, one moderate left, they actually have more differences, okay, also than those at the extreme ends. And the kind of main argument here is that those at the extreme ends have a gravitation towards authoritarianism, towards totalitarianism, okay, regardless of whether they're on the right or the left. And so they have a lot in common. And this would certainly help explain why extreme ideologies on opposite ends often have the same policies that they endorse. So for example, there's a lot of far right parties here in the US that are against same-sex marriage and abortion for any reason, for mainly religious reasons. And then in Russia, there's extreme communist parties that are also against same-sex marriage and against all forms of abortion. And so they have a lot of policies, social policies, at least in common, that they support. But obviously, this is very simplistic, because even if there are policies that they both have in common in terms of their endorsements, their reasons for those endorsements are going to be very, very different. But also this has been used to explain, for example, why in many cases there's been a surgence of anti-Semitism from both those on the far right and from the far left. So nevertheless, despite there being these criticisms, though, to this spectrum, it's still frequently used. There's still a lot of support for it, in part because people are generally familiar with what's meant, okay, with this language, with what it means to be on the right versus what it means to be on the left. The classic issues of economic issues, such as to do with taxes and whether to be in support of social welfare, and the classic social issues as well, seem to still be, largely in debate and still largely important to people when making these sorts of decisions. And when you ask someone to describe where their political leanings lie, they're still frequently using these terms, okay, to do with being on the left or the right, telling us that they do still have, significance and relevance. But rather than viewing this as just one spectrum, many have argued that we should begin to view it at least as two spectrums, okay? A spectrum to do with social political views, and then a spectrum to do with economic political views, okay? And so this has given rise to tests like the political compass. Maybe you've seen this before. Hands up if you've taken this test. Okay, a few, okay, less than half, okay. So this was developed by some political scientists, right? Now, there is a strong correlation, okay? If you're on the right on economic issues, you're likely to be on the right on social issues, and vice versa if you're on the left. But there are exceptions, okay? There's people who are on the right on economic issues and who are on the left on social issues, okay? So they're different. You know, economic issues are those to do with how taxes should be spent and how much people should be taxed and so on. And then those to do with social issues are to do with how people should live their lives in regards to same-sex marriage, in regard to abortion, in regards to gun rights and so on, okay? So obviously it is possible for one to be on the right on, you know, one of these spectrums, on the left of the other, okay? But these are just one tests that, you know, give your score based upon two different spectrums, okay? Now, looking at what we know predicts some differences, okay, in voting behavior, before I get to personality, one large one is moral foundations, okay? And the moral foundations theory was developed by Jonathan Haidt primarily and some other colleagues. And his text, The Righteous Mind, really kind of sums up the differences that have been found on average in moral foundations between those on the right and those on the left. But what are the moral foundations? First of all, there's kind of 5 main original moral foundations here that are classed as being moral universals rooted in intuitive ethics, meaning that they're found across cultures, okay? Wherever the researchers looked, across continents, across countries, and so on, they found that these 5 moral foundations were present and when people were deciding whether something was moral or not, okay, when it was deciding if something was a moral issue. Now, the first 2 are more to do, I guess, with treatment of people. So the first one is whether one is being caring or not, okay, whether one is being sympathetic, whether one is looking out for others. That can be seen as a moral foundation for deciding on, you know, whether something is morally good or not. The second one is fairness. Are you treating people equally? Okay, so that can be another foundation you use to decide if something is being morally correct or morally incorrect. Okay. And then the other 3 are more to do, I guess, with structures of the group or with hierarchies or with tradition. So the third one here is loyalty. Okay, so loyalty to the group primarily is what we're talking about, okay? And then the fourth one is respect for authority, okay? So respect for authority figures in society, respect for maybe commanding officers, you know, given if you're in that situation, respect for parents, okay, or anyone who's kind of seen as an authority figure. And then the fifth one is purity, okay? So respect, okay, to keep clean and pure, okay, that which is meant to be respected, okay. So, you know, some of the questions designed to measure your importance on this last one are a little bit unusual, but some are, for example, you know, how morally wrong would you think it'd be if you burned the American flag in secret? No one would ever know about it, no one would ever see it, okay. Some are, how disgusting do you think it would be, okay, for 2 siblings to have consensual sex if they were using contraception and there was no chance of a pregnancy? Some are less extreme, like how disgusting do you find casual sex, okay? And the kind of takeaway here is what the researchers have found is that, first of all, here in the US liberals are more likely to put importance on the care/harm and fairness moral foundations, okay, than US Republicans are. and far less likely to put importance on the other three. Okay, so a respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and then issues to do with purity. Okay. Now, the researchers not only found this in the US, but whenever they went to another country and split those on the right versus those on the left, they found the exact same pattern. Okay, so here in Canada, again, those on the left putting more importance on the first two, less on the other three. Same thing found in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Latin American countries, and then the Middle East as well. Okay, so wherever they looked, they were finding the same finding. Okay, that those on the right of the political spectrum were likely to consider all five of these as moral issues. Okay, when they were deciding if a behavior was morally wrong or not, they would be using all five of these to a similar degree. Okay, they're all about equal in their minds. Whereas those on the left, they don't view the other three as moral issues really at all, okay, when deciding if something is morally wrong or not, okay, it doesn't come into it, okay, it's not part of the criterion, okay. For them, what's much more important is these first two, okay, the care, harm, and fairness foundations when deciding if something is morally wrong or not. So this can help explain a whole range of differences in behaviors, right, that you might find on the left versus the right. You know, if there is a protest against authority figures, for example, then those on the right would be more likely to find that's morally wrong because it's disrespect to authority figures, right? Whereas those on the left won't view that as a moral issue, okay? So they're going to be more concerned perhaps with what the reason is, okay, for protesting against the authority figure. If one is ostracized from a group, okay, then those on the right might be more likely to think initially, well, what did they do, okay, to warrant being ostracized? Okay, what do they do to go against the group? Whereas those on the left would be more likely to immediately think, well, that's unfair, that's uncaring. Okay. And on issues to do with authority, you know, those on the left, for example, would be more likely to think it's acceptable to cut off a family member, such as a parent, if they, you know, do something that is in disagreement, okay, with what you think is moral behavior. Whereas those on the right would be more likely to view that as morally wrong, okay, that there is a kind of loyalty that comes with being part of a family, okay, and that it's not right to cut off a parent figure. And again, those who score higher in authority would be more likely to follow commands, okay, from a commanding officer, okay, because for them, they're in that position for a reason, okay. Whereas those who don't say that they view authority as a moral foundation, they would be more likely to, you know, question or be disobedient in a scenario in which they were given a command that they didn't agree with. Okay, and then the same found across Asia as well. Okay, so again, wherever they're looking, they're finding the same difference. Okay, between those on the right and those on the left. Now, some critiques of this are maybe, first of all, you know, I mean, the theorists are not saying that, you know, those on the right are more moral than those on the left. They're just saying that there's different criteria used, okay, to decide what is moral from those on the right versus those on the left. But it certainly implies that those on the left have a more kind of narrow view on what is moral behavior, okay? But one critic or one criticism could be that there may be other moral foundations, okay, not captured by this theory. You know, there's no theoretical reason for why these were the 5 moral foundations, okay? They were just the ones theorized and observed by the researchers, but you could likely come up with others that might be just as legitimate in terms of also being a moral foundation. You know, so maybe a respect for the earth or a respect for the environment, for example, could be seen as one, you know, moral foundation. But nevertheless, you know, the reliability over these differences helps us make sense of how those on the right and those on the left across countries make some differences in decisions. Another very interesting text is the text Predisposed by Hibbling Smith and Alford. Now, these are biologists, and so they are looking at the differences between those on the left and those on the right as biologists, okay, through a biological lens. And what they observe in this text is that there are a number of differences in tastes and preferences between those on the left versus those on the right that they argue are rooted in genetic differences. And they begin the text by using a case from Berkeley to exemplify this. And what some researchers found at Berkeley was that when they had a sample of fruit flies and they gave the fruit flies the choice between going to beer versus sugary water, some of the fruit flies preferred the beer and some of the fruit flies preferred the sugary water. Okay, but through selective breeding, they were able to create a population of fruit flies who would prefer one over the other. They could, through selective breeding, have a sample of fruit flies who would all prefer the beer, or a sample of fruit flies who would all prefer the sugary water. Telling us that there is a genetic reason, okay, for this difference in taste, okay, between the fruit flies, as to why some preferred the beer and why some preferred the sugary water. And so what they argue is that something is similar happening in people, okay? There is a genetic reason for differences in tastes and differences in preferences that are observed, okay, between different liberals and conservatives. One example of this that they use pretty early in the text is when President or to-be President Obama was on his presidential campaign in 2006, I think, in Wisconsin, and he said to the audience, have you been into a grocery store and seen the price of arugula lately? And then Fox News and the other kind of sources of media on the right criticized him for this, and his opposition, McCain, tried to also kind of make fun of Obama for this and said, well, I'm more of a kind of sticks and potatoes kind of guy. Now, it seems silly, okay, that, presidential candidates might try to build rapport with potential voters by talking about their preferences for foods and so on. But what surveys then found was that liberals were significantly more likely to have arugula as their favorite vegetable, okay, than Republicans and conservatives were. And then it was replicated again and again, finding a whole range of differences, that those on the left side were more likely to be vegetarian, that they were more likely to choose a dish they've never had before at a restaurant, whereas those on the right were more likely to stick to their favorites. Those on the left were more likely to try exotic cuisines, okay? And the differences they found weren't just to do with foods, okay? There was a whole wide range of differences, that those on the left were more likely to write fiction. They were more likely to be novelists. They were more likely to have arts and craft materials at their home, more likely to have stationary equipment at their home. Whereas those on the right were more likely to have their homes more in order. They were more likely to have laundry baskets and some other items to do with being orderly. Those on the left were more likely to drive foreign cars. Those on the right were more likely to drive American-made cars. Those on the right were more likely to have brand loyalty. Those on the left were more likely to shop around for the cheapest deal. Those on the right were less likely to enjoy dirty jokes. They were less likely to enjoy a movie that had an ambiguous, open-ended ending to it. Okay, they were more likely to enjoy landscape art, less likely to enjoy abstract art. Okay, whereas those on the left were more likely to enjoy an ending to a movie that was open-ended. They were more likely to enjoy abstract art and so on. Okay, so a wide range of differences, okay, that are outlined in this book. And they are biologists, like I say, so they're looking at this through a biological lens, arguing that there's some, genetic differences for tastes and preferences and so on. And indeed, there is evidence for a heritable component to political orientation. Even the Minnesota Twin study found a surprisingly high level of heritability for conservatism and traditionalism and so on. But I would argue that what the differences here are that these researchers are picking up on are differences in personality, right? Pretty much all of the differences they find can be described using differences in conscientiousness and differences in openness, right? Those higher in openness do enjoy more abstract art. They do enjoy fiction writing more. They do enjoy more open-ended endings, okay? Those more on the low end of openness do have a more preference for being more closure orientated. And for those higher in conscientiousness, they are more orderly and so on and so on. So all of these differences that were observed, okay, can really be made sense of using personality traits. Now, that doesn't mean the researchers are wrong, okay? It's just a different way of looking at it, right? Because they're arguing that there's a biological reason for these differences, and there is a biological reason for differences in personality, right? We've looked at that in terms of the personality traits. There's a strong genetic factor to them. Just to be clear, what I'm talking about here, by the way, are generalizations, okay? They're differences found on average. Let's not get carried away. Obviously, there's plenty of Republicans who write novels and plenty of Republicans who enjoy abstract arts and who write fiction, and plenty of liberals who, dislike abstract art and so on, okay? There's plenty of exceptions. What we're talking about here are some general findings found on average, okay? Now, not only can the Big Five be used to make sense of the differences outlined in this text, but actually they can also be used to make sense of the differences outlined in the moral foundations theory work, okay? Because those who are higher in openness are more likely to endorse the care, harm, and fairness moral foundations, and those who are higher in conscientiousness are more likely to endorse the other three, okay? They are more likely to endorse the in-group loyalty, the respect for authority, the purity moral foundations, okay? So again, the differences found by the moral foundation theorists could be made sense of because it's in line with what we would expect from the personality literature, right? So going back to this idea that openness predicts more liberal-leaning ideas and conscientiousness predicts more conservatism. There's some longitudinal studies that found that even very early signs of temperament can predict these later differences in voting behaviors and political orientations. So here in a 2006 study, nursery teachers, okay, when the participants are only about 3 years old, okay, and their behaviors are being rated by the nursery workers. Those who showed signs of higher openness were more likely to vote left-leaning 20 years later when they were 3 years old, okay? Those who showed more signs of conscientiousness when they were 3 years old were more likely to vote more right-leaning parties, okay, 20 years later, okay? So these temperamental differences, okay, can appear early and still have predictive power for later. And these findings replicated in separate larger scale longitudinal studies. So when reviewing the literature, Carney really sums it up like this, that those on the left are more motivated by creativity and curiosity, diversity of experience, right? Okay, more openness to experience, more novel, right? More unconventional, okay? That would explain, right, why they're more likely to have exotic dishes, right, in the predisposed text research findings. Whereas those on the right are more motivated by self-control, norm attainment, and following of the rules. So going a bit deeper into this, trying to explain why these connections exist, why is there this connection between openness and liberalism or progressiveness? First of all, it's a robust finding, okay? From the personality literature, openness is the one that best predicts political orientation, okay? That those high are more likely to vote left, those low are more likely to vote right, okay? And it's been found across measurements, okay? So from the Big Five inventory to the Big Five aspect scale to custom McRae's Neo personality inventory to one-word items, okay? Again and again, we find the same findings, okay? And also, we can measure conservatism on a conservatism scale, political orientation on some scale for that. We can ask their opinions on just one issue, where they fall on the abortion issue, and so on. We can ask them where they plan to vote or which political candidate they plan to vote for. And ever since this research started in 1996, it's been done for every single presidential election. And every single time it's found the exact same results, okay? That those higher in openness were more likely to vote for the Democrat candidates, okay? Regardless of who the candidate was. And those lower in openness were more likely to vote for the Republican candidate, regardless of who the candidate was, okay? So every single presidential election here in the US since the research started in 1996. And then it's been found in other countries too, okay? Again, the exact same findings, okay? In Canada, in Europe, even as far afield as New Zealand, okay? And it's crucial to other big issues as well. You know, in 2016, the UK voted on whether to leave the European Union or whether to remain part of the European Union. And openness was the fourth largest predictor of whether one would vote to remain or vote to leave, okay? A larger predictor than a lot of the issues that the politicians were focusing on. It was a larger predictor than local unemployment rates and local immigration rates, which were really the kind of two factors that politicians would think to be most important. You know, issues that were, or predictors that were more predictive than openness were geography, education attainment, and kind of socioeconomic background. So why does this association exist? Well, you know, liberalism, like pretty much all left-leaning ideologies, is about a gravitation towards challenging tradition, right? And being more likely to support reform, or at least investigate the possibilities of reform and to consider alternative ways of doing things, okay? And indeed, those who are higher in openness are more likely to be novelty seeking, wanting to seek out novel information and hear alternative perspectives and so on. And so that might help create an identity, right, that's more likely to be left-leaning. And then how about this association between conscientiousness and conservatism? Well, you know, conservatism is really about a preference for social norms, okay, and for following the rules. Now, dutifulness, which is an important facet of conscientiousness, really captures what conservatism's definition here is getting at, right? And it's also capturing that loyalty, obedience, respect for authority, moral foundations that we discussed, okay, following of the rules, following of the group norms, okay, following of the authority who's placed the rules. Another way of looking at this is through the connection of disgust sensitivity, because disgust sensitivity is associated strongly with conscientiousness, and also it's associated strongly with conservatism, meaning that those higher in conservatism are more disgust sensitive, okay? And it's not a small effect. I'll go on to show you some examples of the association, okay? But again, since this was done 2008, investigated on whether one would be more likely to vote right or left, those who are more disgust sensitive, more likely to vote for the right-leaning Republican candidate, okay? And then the same thing in 2016, okay? With Trump versus Hillary Clinton. Particularly in regards to sexual disgust sensitivity, okay, which is a subscale of disgust sensitivity, which is kind of about opposition towards casual sex, short-term relationships. And it wasn't a small effect, okay? It was a large effect, okay? With every point above average one was in disgust sensitivity, their odds of voting for Donald Trump increased by 20%, okay? Again, a replicated finding, okay, across world regions, okay? Those on the political right more likely to be higher in disgust sensitivity. Those who are more easily disgusted, even when given just one issue to choose from, are more likely to be on the right side of things, okay, whether it's affirmative action or gay marriage or abortion. And it's, again, across measurements, you know, so we can give someone a disgust sensitivity questionnaire, okay, to self-report how easily disgusted you are. We can look at brain activity to see how disgusted one is by a disgusting smell or a disgusting image, okay? We can have just physiological responses, self-reports, okay, from a revolting smell in the room, revolting images, okay. So again, across measurements, okay, we're getting the same finding. So some researchers have then argued that what largely explains conservatism is a more active behavioral immune system. And so what the behavioral immune system is your likelihood of doing behaviors that will protect you from pathogens, okay, that will keep you from getting sick or to coming into contact with that which will increase your chances of getting sick. So this can include washing your hands, frequently, cleaning food before you cook, and avoiding also certain individuals, okay? At least, long ago, if we think back on what the kind of oldest political debate would have been, it would have been on whether to kind of open the gates to the village or whether to open the borders or not, right? Because in some cases, opening those doors meant that new ideas came in and the society was able to flourish. In other cases, it meant that people brought sickness or they brought death, right? There's many, many examples in human history, right, of foreigners then bringing diseases that those who lived there didn't have the immune systems to protect them from those diseases, right? I'm sure you all know about what happened to Native Americans here in the US, but also to those in South America, right, when the Europeans came over and brought with them their diseases. And what the researchers argue is that this system is likely to be, in many cases, hypersensitive or overreactive because, the cost of a false positive is relatively small in comparison to not responding, okay? And we can look at as an example, the fear of snakes that many people have and how maybe overreactive people are in many cases when they see something that just resembles a snake, okay? Because again, if you fail to respond, what's the consequences? You get bitten by the snake and you die, right? What's the failure of overreacting? Okay, if there's a twisted twig and you think it's a snake and so jump, but it's not, there's no real cost, right? You just maybe look a bit foolish, okay, but there's no actual cost to your life of this. And so similar, okay, when trying to avoid pathogens and disease, again, the system might be overreactive, okay? And so just to help kind of frame this is the parasite stress hypothesis, which is essentially that the more pathogens that there are in an area or the more risk of exposure that there is, okay, this will have an impact on the views, the ideologies, and so on of that community. And they're more likely to then be xenophobic, fearful of strangers. They're more likely to then endorse in-group loyalty, tradition, and be wary of outsiders and outside ideas, okay? Again, because in our evolutionary history, right, this was kind of crucial for protecting oneself against diseases that the immune system hadn't yet learned to protect itself from, right? And, it was only about 100 years ago when 40% of infant deaths were still due to infectious diseases, right? It's only relatively recent in evolutionary history that we've been able to protect ourselves from a wide range of infections. Okay, and in the literature, there's really kind of two main dimensions of conservatism. We have this kind of resistance to change, and then this kind of tolerance for inequality, okay, because it's in keeping with tradition and with the way that things are and with the hierarchy, okay. So what is being argued here is that political conservatism is in part a kind of manifestation of this social immune system or behavioral immune system, in which one is trying to keep the hierarchy as it is. They're trying to maintain tradition, okay, stability, okay, in order to keep away from disruption. And again, kind of protect the purity, if you like, of the social system. Indeed, regions that have more disease prevalence have been found to have more social conformity and more autocratic rule. And then also individuals who feel more vulnerable to disease are more likely to be more xenophobic, okay, fearful of strangers. But probably the best evidence from this, or best evidence for this argument, comes from Murray and colleagues. And they did analysis on 31 different countries and found that the more pathogens that there were in an area, okay, the more authoritarian views that the individuals who lived there held. And the relationship was true even when controlling for other potential threats, okay, such as famine, poverty, natural disasters, and so on. So to kind of put all of this together, why might disgust sensitivity, okay, help explain this association, okay, between this personality and this political orientation? Well, disgust encourages one to be orderly, right? If you're disgust sensitive, you're disgusted easily by mess and disorder. You want everything in its place. You want everything clean and tidy and order. So that's also going to encourage the endorsement of political policies, right, which help maintain order. You know, it shouldn't really be too surprising, right, that your personality will have an influence on the political policies that you value, okay, because it influences your values in so many other ways, right? If you're highly extroverted, you know, you value social opportunities and socializing and so on. And we all accept that, you know, your personality is reflected in the clothes that you wear, the movies you choose to watch, and, you know, all these other differences in tastes and preferences that we have. It's not too surprising that if you're high in orderliness, you're going to put a lot of importance, okay, on political policies that are all about maintaining order, right? Or if your dominant trait is compassion, you're going to put a lot of endorsement on political policies that have compassion at the heart of it, right, above all else, okay? So it's not too surprising that, you know, your personality traits are going to have an influence on your modes of perception, okay, your value system and so on. And again, the most impressive evidence comes from the fact that countries with more disease, okay, are more likely to be associated with more social conformity, okay, and within those countries also, okay, the more disease prevalence that there is, okay, the more risk there are of contact with pathogens and so on, the more social conformity again that we find. Kind of also on the other end of this, just to kind of hammer home that there is a connection here, okay, between disgust and conservatism and so on. When we give people reminders over personal cleanliness, such as telling them to wipe their hands before coming into the research lab, that actually increases, on average, their self-reported conservatism scores. Now, on its own, there might not be an issue here, okay, between the connection between political ideology and disgust sensitivity. But it's easy to imagine how these propensities, okay, for being more worried about pathogens and your worry over disgust can be easily hijacked, okay, for political agendas and so on. And, you know, probably the best example of that is Germany before World War II, right, following World War I. Not only was the country in complete disarray and in complete disorder with crime rates at an all-time high and money having no value whatsoever, but diseases were widespread, right? The men had brought home the Spanish flu that had spread through the trenches. So, you know, disease was a massive issue, as was crime and as was the complete disarray and disorder. And the Nazis really had the draw to them in part because they were promising to clean up the streets. You know, they were promising to clean up the factories and to clean up the criminals on the streets and to bring order back, okay, to the country. And at least for a time, okay, you know, the Nazis were delivering on that, cleaning up the factories and so on. There's a kind of good book, it's a fictional book, but it's based upon the true case of Denmark being occupied by the Nazis, and then the fact that some of the Danish police were opposed to the Nazi rule, and some were actually very in favor of the occupation because of the order that the Nazis were bringing. And I think this character kind of really exemplifies what I'm talking about. So it's a character called Peter Fleming in Ken Follett's book, the Hornet Flight, and he's a Danish policeman. And some quotes that kind of just illustrate what I'm talking about. You know, whatever you say against the Nazis, they were tough on criminals. And his disgust sensitivity, his longing for order, okay, is clear throughout the book, okay, not only in regards to society, but also in regards to his relationships, okay. And you can see that when he talks about his wife here. He says, you know, she had always been neat and clean. It was one of the things he loved about her. She was especially clean about sex, always washing carefully afterwards, something he appreciated. Not all girls were like that. One woman he had slept with had objected to him washing himself after sex, saying it was unromantic. Okay. And so again, his disgust sensitivity is apparent, okay, in all areas of his life, and this longing for order, okay, is very clearly hijacked, okay, by the Nazis' policies, okay, what the Nazis are promising to deliver on, and what they're catering to as well, okay, in terms of his kind of, you know, tendencies, okay, his predispositions, okay. But then there is the issue then of COVID, right? What all of this literature would suggest is that those on the right are more worried about disease. They're more likely to follow rules, okay, when there is the threat of disease. And so all of these researchers would have predicted that Republicans and those on the right would be more fearful of COVID than those on the left, and that they would have been more likely to follow the rules that the government put in place than those on the left. But that's not what was observed, right? The exact opposite was actually found. Those on the right were less afraid of COVID, okay, than those on the left. They were less likely to wear masks and follow social distancing and all those other rules, okay, that the government were trying to mandate, at least in some places. Now, the research on this is still ongoing, but I would argue it's not too hard to come up with some explanations for why. You know, it's not as simple as one thing causing another, right? When it comes to human behavior, there's a whole range of different factors, okay, that impact why one does something. And it may be the case that in this case, lockdowns and other policies were threatening what Republicans valued, okay, other than their, you know, protection from pathogens. So the fact that it may have damaged the economy, the fact that their rights would have been restricted, and so on, okay? So people value more than just one thing, okay? And so one thing doesn't dictate or determine, okay, how they will behave in a scenario. It's influenced by a wide range of things. But also part of this is the particular policies that we're talking about. You know, so for example, those on the right were much more opposed to the enforcement of vaccines, right? That vaccines might have been necessary to travel or to go to certain events. You might have needed proof of having been vaccinated. But we know that actually disgust sensitivity predicts anti-vaccination attitudes. And that's a finding that goes well back, okay, not just to do with the COVID vaccine, but across countries to do with vaccines in general, okay? That those who are more disgust sensitive, they're more disgusted by needles, they're more disgusted by bloods, they're more disgusted by medical procedures. They're more likely to have anti-vaccine attitudes. They're more likely to believe that vaccines cause autism, okay, and a wide range of other anti-vaccine views. So it might be that the particular policies that were being discussed, okay, were, okay, in opposition, okay, to the, well, what those on the right were looking for, or what they are afraid of. Another point is the differences in media consumption, okay? Those on the left and those on the right were watching entirely different news programs. They were reading entirely different sources of information online and on social media, okay? So their understanding of almost all of the issues were entirely different. Now, it was in fact found that self-reported conservatism did predict greater following of the policies during COVID, but only for those on the left, okay, only those who were Democrats, okay, not for those on the right. So again, there very well may be this association, okay, that we're talking about, but it's going to be overwritten by a wide range of other factors, okay, other fears, other concerns, the information that one is consuming, okay, the media and so on, okay, it's an association, okay, that can very easily be moderated, okay, by external factors. Just quickly, what I've mainly talked about so far are associations between personality and differences on social political issues, okay? But there are, of course, also economic issues, okay? Now, again, those on the left are on economic issues, I mean, are more likely to be higher in openness and lower in conscientiousness. Now, agreeableness, when it comes to social issues, okay, at the big five level, has no predictive ability, okay, because it's broken down and has differences that compassion predicts liberalism and politeness predicts conservatism. When it comes to economic issues, agreeableness at the big five level predicts more left-leaning ideologies, okay. Neuroticism, to a smaller extent, also seems to predict more left-leaning attitudes, okay. Perhaps because if one is more prone to worry and anxiety, then they're going to be more in favor of policies that put together a safety net, okay, for those in financial trouble. On agreeableness, it's, again, a relationship that can be mediated by other factors or moderated, really, I should say. So, for example, level of income. Okay, so the kind of summary of this paper here is that high income earners with low conscientiousness or high agreeableness had more liberal economic attitudes compared to high income earners with low agreeableness or high conscientiousness. But of course, level of income is going to matter, okay? Because again, it's not the fact that one thing, such as personality, dictates or determines your voting behavior. It's influenced by a wide range of things. And also what I want to make clear is the effects here are fairly small, okay? The association between personality and political orientation, they're fairly small, okay? But they're an important part of the puzzle and a part that are often overlooked. And they are just as big as most of the demographic factors that are often looked at. So race and age and geography, okay? All of these factors that political scientists put a lot of importance on, personality is just as big an impactor, okay, as these other factors. But all of these individually are small, okay, because they're all individual parts of the puzzle in terms of why people vote so differently, because it's influenced by a wide range of factors. So there are some limitations with this research, okay? Some of the research views political orientation as just one spectrum. More and more, we're viewing it more as two, which is only a good thing. The big five in some cases is viewed as, you know, just five factors, and then some differences aren't observed. Like sometimes I find researchers predicting that those on the right and those on the left will score different in agreeableness, and then to their surprise, they find no significant findings. But then you actually look at their measurements, and they're mainly looking at differences on social issues, and then it's no surprise, okay, because they're just looking at the big five level. And if they had actually read the literature in depth, they would know that there's a difference in compassion and a difference in politeness in predicting differences in political orientation. So problematically, a lot of the literature still just looks at the big five level and doesn't narrow down to the aspects or facets. Okay, so kind of overview, okay, on personality, big five traits, and political orientations. With the time we have left, I want to talk about authoritarianism, okay, this personality traits and how this also is related to politics. So authoritarianism is a term that came up with by Erich Fromm, who was a psychoanalyst who was pretty loyal to Freud's ideas for the most part, and his idea on the authoritarian personality was someone who suffers from neurotic anxiety because they have an id who has desires that are, you know, not in keeping with society's acceptance, but also they have a superly rigid superego. So they also suffer from moral anxiety. And for Erich Fromm, this was because of incredibly strict parents, okay, who would discipline them harshly for stepping out of line. And so they have this super strong superego. And they're suffering from both moral anxiety and neurotic anxiety, but their ego is not strong enough to control their ids. Okay, their ego is weak. Their ego is too weak to live up to the ideals of their superego. So what they do is they find an authority figure, okay, who represents the ideals and values of their superego, okay, and then they bow down to that authority figure, okay, and they believe that by doing this, okay, that will keep their anxieties at bay. Bowing down to this authority figure, okay, whether it's an authoritarian political leader or whether it's a religious leader or whatever it might be, okay, whatever the scenario is, they have this authoritarian leader, okay, that is in keeping with their superego, and then by following this, okay, they think that will keep their id in control. Now, if you look at citations of the authoritarian personality or authoritarianism, the 1950 book by Adorno and colleagues is most frequently what you'll find. And it is probably the best known text, but it's highly based upon Erich Fromm's ideas, okay? And what the 1950 text was really aiming to do was taking Erich Fromm's authoritarian personality and using it to explain what happened in Nazi Germany, that there was a higher than normal level of authoritarianism in Germany at this time, according to the researchers. And this was explaining why they bowed down to Nazi rule and didn't question the morally wrong things that the Nazis were doing in Nazi Germany. I think a very clear example of an authoritarian personality in terms of what Erich Fromm was talking about is Claude Frollo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? He has a incredibly strong, okay, superego. He thinks that, any degree of lust is completely morally wrong, okay? But he also has an id that is prone to desire and that he can't on his own control. So instead, he completely bows down to an authority figure, which for him is, his interpretation of religion, okay? And by bowing down to this God, he also believes that he's, living out the commands of this authority figure, okay? And by aligning himself with this authority figure, he's morally righteous, and that therefore is keeping his anxieties at bay. Now, the F scale, F for fascism, was designed to measure authoritarianism as outlined by Fromm and Adorno. So Adorno came up with this in 1947. And the idea here is that those who would score highly on this trait are more conventional, more rigid, okay, and more hostile and aggressive towards deviants and minorities also. Now, they came up with a right-wing fascism scale and left-wing. And initially, it was very, very popular with other researchers and so on, but then the criticisms really began to collect. First of all, the left-wing authoritarianism scale did not work, okay? Everyone would score low on this, okay? It didn't predict anything. There was no real normal distribution. But if you look at the items, it's not too surprising, okay? There are items like, would you overthrow the government if this happened and so on. They're kind of the items that only a crazy person would agree to for the most part. And the samples that this scale was based upon for attaining norms and so on was pretty small and poorly constructed. The idea here was that these early parent relationships are what caused the authoritarian personality, but the researchers really couldn't find any evidence to back this up. And then the final nail in the coffin, if you like, was when 16 actual Nazis at the Nuremberg trials took this scale and all scored low. So, if you've designed a scale that you say measures a personality trait that explains why Nazis do what they do, and then Nazis score low on it, okay, then obviously it's not actually helping at all to explain the behavior that you're claiming it helps. So it completely died out after that, but then interest in this was really brought back by Altmaier in 1988, who constructed the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And this is the scale you're probably more familiar with, okay? This is the one that's still used in research in contemporary psychology. So this right-wing authoritarianism scale identifies three different clusters, okay? A submission to an authority figure, aggression towards minority groups that authority figure targets out, and then adherence to political beliefs also that are endorsed by the authority figure. Now, openness in the big five negatively predicts right-wing authoritarianism. It also negatively predicts prejudice and social dominance orientation, which is another trait I'm going to come back to. But right-wing authoritarianism is one of the strongest predictors of prejudice, okay, of discriminatory beliefs, whereas openness is one of the strongest negative personality predictors of prejudice and discriminatory beliefs. So those who score high in right-wing authoritarianism are less likely to be critical thinkers. They're less likely to believe that all of one's problems are due to a scapegoat once that scapegoat has been identified. They're less likely to pick up on inconsistencies, okay? And according to the researchers, right-wing authoritarianism is better understood through the lens of social learning theory rather than psychoanalytic theory, okay? So if one has these discriminatory views, for example, then in most cases, they've learned them from the household in which they were brought up or from, surrounding themselves with people with similar views. Now, social dominance orientation is similar in that it's a personality trait in part used to help predict discriminatory beliefs and prejudice. Indeed, those who score high on this believe that some people in society are meant to dominate and they're meant to dominate over others, okay? And research does also suggest that those who score high in this trait come from pretty cold, aloof, unsupportive parents, okay? Now, what's interesting is that social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism predict almost the exact same outcomes, okay? There's only one main noticeable exception, and that's religiosity, okay? Right-wing authoritarianism predicts one being more likely to have religious beliefs, whereas social dominance orientation does not. But despite the fact that they predict almost the exact same outcomes, they're not correlated together to a strong extent, okay? Meaning that even though they're causing the same outcomes or leading to the same outcomes, they're doing so potentially for different reasons, okay, and they are somewhat independent from each other. Now, it's been used to help explain the fact that maybe there are two types of authoritarian personalities. Maybe there is a more submissive type who would be high in right-wing authoritarianism, and then a more dominant type who would be high in social dominance orientation. Just in line with this, there is a text called the Revolutionary Totalitarian Personality, and it looks at totalitarian leaders on both the right and the left. So Hitler, who's often viewed as being on the extreme right, and then Castro and Mao, who are viewed as being on the extreme left, and finds that, despite them having the exact opposite political views on social issues, at least, their personality traits are very, very similar. They both have high scores of narcissism and psychopathy, and all have high scores of social dominance orientation. And so maybe this kind of totalitarian leader can be explained through all of these particular personality traits. Now, just to be clear, okay, conservatism and authoritarianism are not the same thing. Conservatism is not the same as right-wing authoritarianism either, okay? Right-wing authoritarianism is a view that the world is a dangerous place, and thereby one must submit themselves, okay, to conservative attitudes rigidly, without question, okay, obediently, okay? That's where the problems arise, okay? And then social dominance orientation is the view that the world is a competitive jungle, and therefore one has to prove their superiority and dominance over other groups, okay? Now, both right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation have the likelihood of bolstering discriminatory attitudes, okay? Meaning that if one is high in either of these traits, then given the right situational variables, they can very easily be turned against other groups, okay, such as minority groups, okay? But the situational variables that give rise to this are quite different, okay? Because what it seems is that it's more social issues, okay, that impact the ones who are high in right-wing authoritarianism, and it's more economic issues that impact those who are high in social dominance orientation. So what that means is, you know, if you're high in social dominance orientation, you could be quite easily turned against a minority group if it was told to you that that minority group is stealing all of the jobs and they're responsible for your financial distress. Whereas if you're high in right-wing authoritarianism, it would suggest that you could quite easily be turned against a minority group if you're told that this minority group is causing crime or is responsible for disturbing the social issues that you value, okay? Now, what I lastly want to mention is two new forms of authoritarianism that certainly need to be more researched in order to replicate the findings, because Moss and O'Connor are pretty much the two researchers doing all of the publications in this right now. But what they argue is that right-wing authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, all these other ways of capturing authoritarian personalities, they're not what's currently most important. What they argue is the most current forms of authoritarianism that matter most are political correctness authoritarianism, which is thought to characterize the regressive left, and then white identitarianism, which is thought to capture the alt-right, okay? Now, white identitarianism refers to a longing for white solidarity, okay, and protection against white victimization. So those who score high in this trait believe that whites, particularly white men, have been unfairly dealt with or unfairly given unfair hands dealt to them, I guess, by egalitarian policies and by the increase in rights for other groups in society, and that they should band together and protect themselves against these infringements on this and try to get things back to where they were when white men had, you know, more rights and so on. And then those who score high in political correctness authoritarianism. Now, first of all, political correctness is censoring out that which might be upsetting or triggering to other groups, okay? Now, political correctness on its own is a pretty vague, broad term. It's not really predicted by very much other than compassion, openness, the kind of typical personality traits that predicts most left-leaning ideologies. But political correctness authoritarianism is that anything that is counter, okay, to egalitarianism, anything that has even the potential of upsetting groups should be completely cancelled and completely censored out, okay? So those who score high on political correctness authoritarianism believe that books like Huckleberry Finn should be removed from libraries, okay, because of offensive language. They believe that topics such as biological reasons for personality differences between the sexes should not be taught in universities because it could be an offense against egalitarianism, okay? So it's about cancelling out and censoring out anything, okay, that's likely to be against egalitarianism or to trigger particular groups, okay? So they would be likely, of course, to not have someone give a talk, okay, who might be giving ideas that could be, you know, triggering to some or controversial. Now, what the two researchers argue here, Moss and O'Connor, is that these are the two current most worrying forms of authoritarianism, and they put forward surveys that reveal that more than 50% of Americans are worried about the increase in white supremacists, and they're worried about cancel culture and so on, that tell us that, you know, maybe these are real concerns by those in the US. And they also argue, much like the horseshoe theory, okay, that those who are political correctness authoritarian or on the white solidarity. Either of those are likely to have much more in common with each other than they will with moderates, or that moderates will with each other. Okay. And so to investigate this, they've done a number of studies in which they've given, a number of personality surveys to both of these authoritarian types. And again, they have found a lot of similarities in support of the horseshoe theory, okay, that once one gets to these extreme ends, they are gravitating towards authoritarianism and have a lot in common. So both score highly in black-white thinking, okay, meaning that they view things in black and white terms, okay, either, you're part of the group or you're against the group, okay, one wrong thing can be enough to have you, ostracized. They both score high in psychopathy. They both score high in narcissism. These are traits we've already talked about, right? Self-entitlement, grandiosity, lack of empathy. They both score high in entitlement. Some differences, those high in political correctness, authoritarianism, are more likely to have had overprotective parents. Those high in WI, more likely to be high in Machiavellianism. So remember, that's that manipulation and view that people should be viewed upon negatively. Low openness for WI, low politeness, high orderliness. For the most part, that's not too surprising because it's in line with on the extreme right. The only real exception is low politeness, because usually those on the right are high in politeness. For PCA, lack of resilience, high compassion, low politeness. Okay, lack of, again, not too surprising because it's in line with those on the left. What's unusual is that they're not high in openness. Okay, because usually those on the left are high in openness. Okay, so still something that needs more further research. Okay, but just a kind of recent view on how authoritarianism might be characterized. Okay, any questions before we finish up? Okay, if there is, you can come up and ask. Okay, otherwise, thanks everyone. See you next time.